This is part 4 on chapter 7 on feminism. So this will be the last video, and this will be quite a bit shorter than the other three. So continuing on with our discussion of current trends. So third world feminism. So remember we had in an earlier chapter that third world sometimes was referred to as being, so during the a lot of the 20th century we had two major sort of spheres of influence in the world. That from the United States was one, and that under the Soviet Union was the other. So then the third world was sort of often thought of as everybody else. Sort of like if you weren't aligned with the United States or you weren't really aligned with the Soviet Union, sort of everybody else in there. But then third world gradually developed, and the meaning changed to be more, we're just talking about so very sort of poor. So the term third world has been replaced in recent decades by the word developing, right? Because again, nobody really liked the idea of being referred to as the third world. It kind of just made you sound like not just a second class citizen, but a third class citizen. So that really wasn't a nice thing. So today we have the idea of developing and developed countries, although sometimes the poorest of the poor are called LDCs, the least developed countries. So again, thinking about the very poorest countries like in the Caribbean or Africa, Asia, places like that. In any case, returning to feminism, so you can see here related to third world feminism. So I think we've talked about in the course that, and some students have brought up the issue of, say, in China, where, for example, when they had the one-child policy for many years, it was the case that excess girls were often aborted or killed at birth. So you ended up with sort of this, and it was obvious that some of that was happening where I think figures showed that they'd have something like, for every 100 boys and men, there were like something like 115 or 118 women and girls. So, sorry, it was flip those numbers. So many more boys and men than girls and women. So the idea there is that should be much closer than that. So, for example, in our country today, I think it's more than 50% women, but not that much. It's not a huge distinction there. So we also see in some of these countries where fewer girls survive to maturity, and there's also the case, as we saw in the very beginning of this chapter, there's obvious mistreatment in many developing countries, including Afghanistan. So the second part here relates to the issue of reproductive rights. So often when we think of feminism, particularly in the United States, Western Europe, other places, reproductive rights is really one of the main things that feminists would focus on. So in large part, they're just talking about the right of a woman to control her own body. So sometimes, again, when people think about the abortion debate and the religious issues that might come into that, feminists would still say, well, yeah, but at some level, if you're against pro-choice, things like that, that they would argue that you're still sort of interfering with the woman's right to have control over her body and what's happening inside it. So related to that, if you click on this link in your PDF there, so I put in here, so individual versus institution. So what I meant by that is we've had this interesting dynamic in our country in recent years, well, probably longer than that really, where when we look at certain issues, are we looking at more at an individual level or with the institution? So if you click on that article, you'll see this pop up here. So again, talking about Obamacare versus the Catholics. So this is this idea that some of the stipulations and the provisions in Obamacare that maybe some of those went against the teachings and the beliefs of the Catholic Church. So, say for example, like the University of Notre Dame, right? That you probably know from their football team, against Catholic University. So the idea is, the provisions of Obamacare that would say, for example, that the health insurance company has to provide contraception, right? Has to provide birth control. So, well, if the Catholic Church is against that, their stated position is women should not use contraceptives like that. Well, then, should they be forced to provide insurance for their employees if that is part of it? So they would be claiming kind of more of a religious issue, or the freedom of religion, that they should not be forced to do something that's uh, against their wishes. Whereas on the other side, well, women, for example, women employees of that, of Notre Dame, for example, or any other sort of institution affiliated with the Catholic Church, would say, well, yeah, but shouldn't it be more of an individual decision? So a recent case related to that as well, that the Supreme Court even looked at, was, you might have heard of Hobby Lobby, the sort of craft goods store. So that's, again, more of a conservative, family-owned company, and they also said the same thing, that they did not want to, provide insurance that offered those sorts of provisions for women. Um, so again, it's kind of been a big legal issue related to some of these things. All right, so then our final slide here. So we'll continue on with the current trends. So remember earlier in the chapter we talked about, um, first wave feminism was sort of thought of to be mostly related to women getting the right to vote. So that was, again, one of the earliest things that women were looking at, because they thought, hey, once we get the right to vote, then we can really influence a lot of other things that are important to us. So then second wave is more about, like, say, the 1960s, 1970s, the sort of women's movement in the United States, that in large part coincided with the civil rights movement. Because again, African Americans, women, and other groups felt like their civil rights were infringed upon. We're kind of arguing for a lot of the same stuff. Equal treatment under the law, no discrimination, all those type of things. So then third wave feminism, which would be more of the period that we're into in modern period. So this is this idea that feminist concerns can be extended to other groups, or other issues, such as gay and lesbian issues, post-colonial issues, and those that have to deal with race. So again, thinking about kind of broadening the spectrum of what it might cover. So in this respect, you can see that I've written here, it's more of a cultural and local movement than a political one. So related to some of the earlier slides, that what might be important for women in one country might be very different than what's important to women in another country. So third wave feminism attempts to cover some of those issues. Or, for example, a really poor country might have different issues as far as women and equality than a very rich country. So related to that, there's also the sort of issues focused on the sex industry. So feminists and others are looking at the issues of trafficking. Again, so there's millions of women around the world that are trafficked, right? So often from poor backgrounds. So even here in the United States, right? So it's important to remember that slavery still exists in this country, just not the type of institutional slavery that we saw up until 1865. So in this country, it takes the form more of, a girl in Eastern Europe, for example, that's, sort of said, hey, some kind of shady guys say, we have a great opportunity for you. We have a great opportunity for you to be a waitress here in the United States, over in the United States. Why don't we let you go over there and you can try some of that stuff. So then, of course, when they get here, it's very different. So that doesn't tend to be the case. All right, so then the last part here is all about is exploitation. So same type of thing, related to strip clubs or something like that. So feminists would say, really, is that in the interests of women and society as a whole, or is that sort of a real decent part of society, or those type of things should be done away with. All right, so I think that's a good place to stop here. So hopefully you have a good understanding of feminism at this point, and what a huge part of what I wanted you to see in these slides and videos here is that there's lots of different components to feminism. That it's not just this one little thing that people often refer to. And I think it's also important to remember, say from the very beginning, the textbook talks about that. When we look at political ideology, again, ideology being the values and beliefs that a group of people hold to be the truth, right? And that they also recommend, sorry, that they discard aspects that don't fit well into that ideology. Um, so for he says, for example, a lot of women would come up to hear him and say, "Well, I'm not a feminist, but," then they list 10 things that fall into the feminist political ideology. So sometimes it's interesting to look at those kind of aspects as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead and end the video here.